Okay. Order in the court. The session is about to begin. Today's presenter is Ken Kirsch, a political scientist from Boston College, and the title of your paper is, this went seamlessly well, Originalism's Curiously Triumphant Death, the Interpenetration of Aspirationalism and Historicism in U.S. Constitutional Development. Well, I can't imagine a more provocative title than that, so I hope you deliver the goods on the provocative stuff. Ken?
Great. Thanks. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Jim and especially Emer for inviting me to this conference, and to UNAM and to Mexico City and to Mexico. I've really enjoyed it. I found it very, very interesting, and I'm enjoying the conference as well. So I really appreciate the invitation and the hospitality, and especially the invitation to talk about a great book. So the way I look at it, this is a great, this is the debate that Jim is essentially refereeing here, assessing, is in the United States, in constitutional theory, sort of the central debate. And in fact, it has been for much of the 20th century in constitutional theory. And this is a debate between living constitutionalism versus originalism. It's particularly became a debate in the second half, or particularly the last third of the 20th century. And one of the virtues of this book, as some people have mentioned, is that Jim talks about the most recent, up-to-date, and sophisticated versions of living constitutionalism and originalism, rather than what many people take to be the canonical statements of these, but I think they have been refined. So Jim is dealing with the refined literature and assessing it, and that's a real contribution. And the added virtue is he nearly reaches the right conclusion. So this is the closest I've come to agreeing with Jim of anything that I've read so far. However great the other stuff is. So I'm approaching this from a different perspective than most of the other, probably all of the other presenters, because I'm not a normative theorist. I describe myself here as empirical and positivist. But, you know, you could just say I'm a historian or intellectual historian. I guess I'm just concerned more with a description of what people actually say and situating this debate within that, rather than making a normative case that one approach is better than the other. Obviously, from the title, I think you'll see that my approach is somewhere in the middle, and I think Jim's is as well. So my sympathies are with people like Bobbitt and Dick Fallon, who tend to be, whose theories about what arguments we use in constitutional argument in the United States are fairly descriptive. So this is Philip Bobbitt's modalities, which are essentially a list of the types of arguments that Fallon and Bobbitt observe courts making. And there are multiple types of arguments: history, text, original meaning, public policy, principle. It's a melange of different, and as a fact, I subscribe to that. If you look at all of American history, in fact, there isn't one right. There may be one theoretically right way to make an argument if you're a philosopher, but in practice, it's always been a bit of a mutt. The judges use different types of arguments in different cases. And by the way, that description that Fallon and Bobbitt make about the types of arguments is a description of how judges make constitutional arguments. And so essentially they're talking about a professionalized craft, a discourse, These are experts on interpretation, or at least they're charged with being experts on interpretation of legal texts. And it's a discourse of a professionalized discipline or craft. But if one branches out beyond judges and asks what kinds of arguments are used in constitutional debate in the public sphere, so for example, in electoral politics, in social movements, by interest groups, then you move beyond a disciplined argument into sort of wide open, open-ended claim making. And I think for philosophers, particularly normative philosophers, that is just too messy. You know, you can't say the public or people running for office can use this type of argument and cannot use that type of argument. So when we talk about popular constitutionalism, as Larry Kramer said, it gets away from the philosophers inevitably. And I don't know whether I want to follow Larry Sager in saying that we describe that as a practice. Practice to me seems a little more, I was just doing yoga, right? That's a practice, right? So it has a discipline to it. And if you call constitutionalism a practice, you know, I might call it has a history, but I would question the use of the term practice. It's a culture, it's a history, and to some extent, in courts, it's a practice. I'm interested in what has actually happened with constitutional argument, and as such, I'm not interested in ought. Okay? The problem is, of course, that in American history there is a lot of ought in the is. So judges and people who are not judges are throughout American history making aspirational claims and moral arguments from the beginning. Now, I'm going to make an argument about when that moves to the center of constitutional discussion rather than just being one of many modalities, but at least in the form of one of many modalities, aspirational arguments have been there from the beginning. Our topic, at least for the conference, is not the fact of these types of arguments in courts or popular constitutionalism, but the way that this is framed is that it's a battle. It's a battle between living constitutionalism and originalism, and Jim wants to call it for the aspirationalists. I mean, he's worked out the arguments, he's worked out the logic, and Jim's conclusion is that aspirationalism, moral arguments, a philosophical approach, is fundamental. And historical arguments are secondary and in service of moral arguments in constitutionalism. And one of his ways of challenging originalism is to define it as an ism, which means that it is one type of way that says this is the only correct way to read the Constitution. And he says originalism as an ism is actually pretty new. What I want to argue in this paper is that living constitutionalism, aspirationalism, is also an ism. So there are isms on both sides. And you can see this in the fact that each wants to call it for one side or the other. That's the definition of an ism. It's a monism, that there's a correct approach, and it's either aspirationalism or originalism. Jim wants to call it for aspirationalism or living constitutionalism. I don't want to do that. Okay. So one question I have, which I'll just throw out there, is I'm going to use these terms interchangeably, but I'm going to distinguish them in the course of my discussion. If I go according to my notes, there should be a distinction between living constitutionalism, a concept, and moral readings, because you can have a living constitutionalism without a moral reading. So I'll talk about that. But I'm going to use them interchangeably, probably in error. But in a lot of the paper, I don't talk about it. And my conclusion is that history shows that both of these, the change-oriented moral view and the historical view, are perpetually intertwined in American constitutional development. They always have been, and they always will be, especially since the Civil War. And my argument to philosophers, normative philosophers, is that they should accommodate that that's the reality. And by the way, I do think that Jim is doing that, which is why I think that I don't agree with how he does it, but the mere fact that he's attempting to do that is particularly important. Okay? So the way I structure this paper is I talk about, to get at the theme of intertwined approaches, one thing I do is show the degree to which aspirationalism in American constitutional development has incorporated history. And then from the other perspective, I try to show the degree to which historical approaches have incorporated aspirationalism. And again, my conclusion is that that's inevitable. And that's what I like about this book, that Jim moves a step in that direction, several steps in that direction. By the way, another question I had for Dick Fallon in that whole colloquy that we had was how much of his objection to intertwining history with analytic philosophy depends on the nature of the arguments as religious. Because you can talk about history and stories and narratives without having a religious framing. But the way he discussed this was that's going to muck up the rigor of the philosophical logic. And I don't think that's peculiar to a religious approach. It could also be a criticism of intertwining a historical approach with the analytic philosophy. So one problem for Jim in writing this book, Jim praises Jack Balkin very highly, and actually Dick Fallon kind of praised him very highly, but he said, that's not us. We don't do that. It's interesting what he's doing. Larry talked about that a little bit with Robert Cover. And it's a plea to keep normative, analytic, Dworkinian, the virtues of that would be lost by mixing that with Balkin. So it's not a criticism for Balkin. And Jim actually, as I mentioned, I guess, in a brief comment during the discussion, Jim does go a long way, not just on this essential point of incorporating history into things, but he goes a long way, as I see it, to meeting the originalists, not just the theoretical originalists, but let's put it this way, conservatives, contemporary conservatives, in sort of stepping back from judicial supremacy, the idea that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution is necessarily the correct, or at least the final one. He steps back from what Sandy Levinson calls a Catholic approach, which means that there's this is the same thing, basically, a single authoritative interpreter of constitutional meaning, takes a more Protestant pluralist approach, and he, as I said, he steps back from condemning or eliminating historical arguments to welcoming them in a very pronounced and public way. And then, of course, the duty to fidelity as a rule of law approach is also so these I see as steps in the direction, at least, of conservative originalism. And I do say, he makes an argument that this was in Dworkin all along, and some of it kind of is, but he's emphasizing it to a degree that it had not been previously emphasized. But he does have a hierarchy of values, and as I said, history is subservient. It's a servant and not a rival to considerations of justice. It's the minor premise to philosophy's major premise about justice and the nature of the good. Okay? So there is a vestigial monism in this that I would criticize. This is something that originalism was particularly good about. So I reject this hierarchical relationship, and I argue for mutually constituted. By the way, let me say something about originalism and history. My argument is also, and I've said this before many times to Jim, is that the decision by the leading liberal constitutional theorists, and by liberal I mean Democrats in the United States, the Democratic Party. I'm not shying away from political parties. I'm a political scientist, right? So I don't want to talk about originalism in its purest form of hermeneutics. Originalism, as I'm talking about it here today, is about conservatism and the Republican Party, and liberalism is about Franklin Roosevelt and about Barack Obama. And liberals, I think liberals have shied away from talking about heritage, history, and particularly concepts like patriotism, nationalism, American exceptionalism. I think most liberals today, those concepts are pretty dirty words. I mean, we're in the legacy of the Vietnam War, right? I mean, these are very problematic concepts, but they are inherent in this idea of talking about the history of the Constitution. And liberals, the more they've gotten into analytic philosophy, the more they've ceded the history to the conservatives. And conservatives, that's been a big advantage to the conservatives that I think Jim is starting to write. Okay, so let me talk about living constitutionalism as an ism. And living constitutionalism has a history as well. It is not just the fact that justice has to be primary. Living constitutional, and this history isn't in Jim's account, that's not the point of his book. But first of all, living constitutionalism, the idea that we have to read the Constitution to deal with the times, changing times, interpret it in that light, that's as old as the country itself. And this is why justices of the Supreme Court and legal scholars find it easy to cherry-pick quotations that seem to indicate that there was a living constitution. Of course, as a modality, it was always there. But living constitutionalism as an ism, right, as a theory of this is the best way and the single best way to read the Constitution, has two historical roots as I see it. And interestingly enough, the first was morally aspirationalist. It involved aspiration, and this is in the late 19th century, okay? It involved aspirational conceptions of justice and equality as read into the rights provisions of the Civil War amendments to the Constitution, particularly the 14th Amendment, okay? And it was there were different approaches to it. Some we would call reformist social movement aspirationalism, so this is abolitionists to begin with, women's rights advocates, and I would also even say what today we would call conservative aspirationalists. So someone like Justice Stephen Field, who's viewed as kind of a laissez-faire conservative, was an aspirationalist about liberty. Libertarians are moral aspirationalists about liberty. Right? You know, famous aspirationalists would be people like Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, the Seneca Falls the citing of the Declaration of Independence, Susan B. Anthony about women's rights to vote. These were more, and Stephen Field about freedom, the natural, rights to practice your trade and or have a job. And these are all, and what makes this an ism is a sense that not only is this the single right way to do it, but that U.S. constitutionalism is about a trajectory toward this goal or end, whether it be liberty or equality or something like that. And I would say that the constitutionalism before the Civil War, while you could find aspirationalist argument, the basic structure, as Woodrow Wilson said, it was more Newtonian. It was ambition counteracting ambition. It was more structuralist. It was counterbalancing and gravitational. And after the Civil War, you start to have aspirationalism, living constitutionalism, as a linear trajectory towards some end, and people would disagree about the end. The second sort of living constitutionalism, coming at about the same time, is progressive majoritarianism, premised on the view that the Constitution is essentially about democracy. And a robust reading of the best constitutional order is the one that is maybe not to the ultimate extreme, and in some cases to the ultimate extreme, democratic in a majoritarian sense. And this is what Jim sees in the work of Sandy Levinson, an echo of that, Living Constitutionalism, and Mike Seidman as well. So that's very different from the moral aspirationalism, or at least the courts are out of it. It's moral aspirationalism in a non-constitutional sense. Now, there are varieties of this. So some are more extreme than the others. Some are anti-constitutionalist, anti-fidelity, pure majoritarian. Some are Thayerite, which is minimally constitutionalist. Mostly, it's a default rule that you, as Larry mentioned, you mostly decide in anything that isn't absolutely clear, you defer to the popular branches. And then another version, and this is a version that Jim adopts in this book, was there from this time period forward, and it's the intermediate version. And it was held by Charles Beard in 1932. It was held by Woodrow Wilson. And this is the idea that many provisions of the text are either factually, through error, maybe as Larry says, but maybe deliberately, as Larry Sager said, broad, ambiguous, indeterminate, whatever term you want to use for that. And we must interpret it in light of our current needs. Okay? So the first generations of these living constitutionalists, I'm going to say, told stories, and particularly the progressives. They were living constitutionalists who told stories about the American Revolution. They told stories about the meaning of the Civil War. They told stories about the progress of man. And they viewed the United States as providentially, as having a unique role in those stories, or mission, even. Herbert Croly, most famously in The Promise of American Life, re-narrated the American founding by saying he wants to achieve Jefferson. The time is right. We have to now achieve our Jeffersonian ends by Hamiltonian means. And what that means is, to protect equality and rights, we need a strong central state. But the way he presented that was a story about the relationship of Hamilton and Jefferson. So a story about the founding. And so the progressives in particular were very in touch with history, heritage, and that was part of our constitutional practice. By the way, a lot of these people, there's a disjunction here, because while they were patriotic, nationalistic, talked about the American Revolution, the Civil War, and Lincoln, at the same time they condemned the idea that the Constitution, as Charles Beard said, was like the Ark of the Covenant. They condemned constitutional veneration. So it is an interesting, those don't necessarily have to go together. So it's quite interesting. And the article I'm talking about is Charles Beard's article, The Living Constitution, from the 1930s. So it's later Charles Beard. And I think what happens today is that actually conservatives have picked up that echo of telling these stories and focusing on history and patriotism. Now we view that as not as conservative, not liberal, but there's nothing inherent in that. Okay, let me talk the other way around. I'm following my time a little closely. Oh, wow, that's not what mine says, but okay, I have to keep going. Yes. Okay.
5-6 more minutes.
Yes.
Jim has 10.
Yes. I'm taking that 1 minute colloquy.
Sorry.
I'm taking that colloquy as my time. Okay, now let's talk about the aspirationalism in historicism. So the history people, the originalists, I mean, the idea is Jim is saying that they're not aspirationalists. And actually, I think that they themselves see themselves as not being aspirationalists. The problem is that gives too much discretion to judges. And it's true that the first originalist as isms, Robert Bork, Edwin Meese, Raoul Berger, reacting to the Warren Court, they they are very much, well, what I would say is that these people are progressives. In other words, their argument was a revival of the old progressivism, which focused on judicial restraint and majoritarianism. So there's nothing inherently conservative about that position. They were essentially saying, aha, right? You liberals and progressives had it right in the progressive era, but you've betrayed it. You've betrayed your theory, and we're going to hold you to it. So Edwin Meese is reviving the progressive arguments that I've just seen, and we saw that in Justice Sutton's opinion when he talks about leaving it to Democratic majorities. Okay? So the charge is that they're doing Lochnerism, substantive due process. Okay, so that's true for Bork and Scalia and the first old originalists, as we call them now. But then Jim and Linda both have papers in which they cite these newer originalists, Calabrese, Michael McConnell, Mike Ramsey, Ilya Salmon, right, who engage in moral readings. And they say, aha, see, you're betraying the old originalism in a way, right? And I would say to that is that, yes, they're departing radically from originalism as set out by Meese and Bork, which was progressivism, right? But if you look back in American history, there's nothing that says conservatism can't be linked to moral aspirationalism. My God, if you know anything about American politics in the public sphere, you know that moral aspirationalism and conservatives, they make a lot of moral arguments. And Justice Field, again, his slaughterhouse dissent is a broad rights view, broad view of the rights-based meaning of the Civil War, and a view about a reading of liberty. And then I would just make the other point, and this is about Straussians, okay? So there is a current group of conservatives who are very much moral readers of the Constitution, and the point I want to make about this, and this is a post-World War II group of students of Leo Strauss, mostly conservative, not all, certainly we have Saad Barber, and other people, and they challenged majoritarianism and legal positivism and had a very rigorous sense of moral readings of the Constitution, an ends-based reading of the Constitution, and the nature of the importance of focusing on the good. And to me, one of the most important points to make is that these Straussians figure almost not at all in the law school debates or history because they were not law professors, right? So they're almost invisible to the whole trajectory of liberal constitutionalist versus originalist debate. They're not part of the debate for the most part amongst people debating these issues. But they were a huge part of conservative thinking about the Constitution. They are major constitutional theorists. So what's happening is that I think that their influence has been increasing because the old originalists were focused on issues of the judiciary and judicial restraint. And Straussians don't care about that. I mean, they may care about it incidentally. They may care about it in a substantive reading of judicial restraint. But their view is you should think about what's right about the Constitution and what's wrong about the Constitution, not about what's going to constrain judges or deferring to majorities, God help you, right? And so therefore, at a time in which conservatives, the modern conservative movement and Republican Party is not that interested in judicial restraint anymore, they're interested in substance. They're interested in repealing the welfare state, the New Deal. When they're interested in that sort of thing, and when they're interested in aspirationalist libertarianism, they are inevitably going to start making moral arguments, and it's nothing new in their history. Either it's the libertarianism of Field, or it's the Straussian arguments by Walter Burns, Harry Jaffa, Martin Diamond, right? That's always been there in conservatism, and it's always been a part of the argument. And McConnell and Calabrese are coming to this at an oblique angle from the perspective of the conservative movement, although they're, from the perspective of the debate between in the legal academy, it's different. So, there's also a Burkeanism that was always there, and maybe I scribbled down Philip Kurland, I don't know, I didn't look that up, but, there's always this idea of a Burkeanism. And I would also say that these Straussians, so I'm thinking of Martin Diamond, Walter Burns, non-Straussian, Brent Bozell, they were never originalists in the modern sense of the old originalism. In other words, they consistently said that what we owe the founders is respect, right? Both because it's our country, it's our founding, because they were unusually reflective and wise, and because they set up a system that is good, right, and justifiable on moral grounds. But their view was never that there's some principle that we're bound by that, like Ulysses to the mast. Martin Diamond says, if you're going to depart from what the founders said, they were really good, they thought long about it, you better have a good reason. They didn't say you can't do it because that's law, right? So, and that's the modern argument that Dorff and other people have made, which was there in conservatism all along. So they were not originalists, they're not betraying themselves. So the charge doesn't really hit home, and the battle now is over, as Reva Siegel and Robert Post have said, the battle is now over a substantive constitutional vision. Okay, so just to conclude, in the couple of minutes I have remaining, I want to say that to call this for philosophy over history is kind of a luxury. In my view, it's a luxury of power. And I think that works when your people who are doing the philosophy staff the major centers of power, and you can abstract a bit. You don't have to rally the troops. You don't have to. It's a luxury of entrenchment and hegemony. It allows a certain philosophic detachment. And to the extent that liberals got into that, conservatives, particularly in the American constitutional culture, rushed into the breach, and that this was problematic. And so I agree with Jim that history has to be brought back. But again, I disagree that we need to call it for aspirationalism. I think the better way to do it would to continue the American constitutional tradition, heritage of thinking about principles and justice in light of where we've been and where we want to go as a people. I think this book is at exactly the right place right now. And again, the real objection I just have is to the inclination to say this one side wins, and we have to rank order these two things rather than view them as they've always been, interpenetrating and interpenetrated. Thanks.
Okay, just so I know, how much time do you have, Jim?
10 minutes. I will take that one for you.
Okay, well, I'll be watching very carefully. Jim will respond now to Ken's paper.
Okay. Thank you very Thank you very much, Ken, for that those rich observations. And I really appreciate the many kind things you say about the project. Now, I also want to acknowledge that in thinking through how I respond to Dick Fallon's criticism about theology or religion, I am going to bear your remarks in mind, because I think you understand, you put it in terms of the importance of narrative or storytelling or heritage or the like. And I think that that's absolutely right, that needs to be a part of the moral reading, that liberals need to construct accounts of our Constitution that show that it's not just a bunch of philosophers philosophizing about liberal justice. And I think I try to get at that through talking about the importance of fit in constitutional interpretation. And also, I think that although I am not an intellectual historian, your picture gives me, I think, support and comfort that this isn't just something that some liberals thought up in the 1960s and since, that it is a durable part of our, I'll use the word our constitutional practice, even though you shied away from it. And I'll have to think about the whole hierarchy thing. I know I say things about history being in service of justice and the like. And I know that moral readers it's assumed that philosophy somehow is going to be the trump card. I tend to think of a lot of these judgments that we make in constitutional interpretation as more all things considered judgments, rather than, you got some lexical ordering and philosophies at the top. I think it's more that all things considered judgments are normative judgments. And it's not that, I don't think of them as being a hierarchy of modalities where we filter it all through the moral reading. But I need to think about how to articulate that more sharply, because it's not just an eclectic mishmash. It is more of a holistic judgment where you take a number of sources of constitutional meaning into account. And it's not like it's not a sequential or a lexical kind of judgment, but I haven't fully articulated how best to put that. So I think that I also want to credit Ken's. Ken is one of the most thoughtful persons in thinking about what the old originalism is. And I think I do acknowledge that in some of my footnotes, the reactive originalism. And I think that fills out and puts a certain cast on the picture that Keith Whittington and others have offered of the old originalism. And I think that's very, very helpful. And I'll have to think about I think that maybe I should just leave it at that and let others come in, and I may come back with some more thoughts as well. So let me just open it up to other.
You do have, just for the record, you do have 5 more minutes.
If I have more, no, I think that I want to let others come in,
Okay.
and if I have more to say. But I appreciate I think it's also very good to have this larger picture that you offer about, and it is true, I'm not sure why, it is true that there are important conservative moral readings that are certainly part of the national discourse that we don't see reflected in law schools. And I'm not really, I don't know how that came to be.
Okay, so let's open it up for discussion. I got one rule, though. No more hating on philosophers, please, because I'm like feeling really bad now. I don't know how the queue goes. I think Larry, then Sot.
Ken, thank you, Ken. Really interesting. And I've been working on living constitutionalism recently. A little bit of that is in the paper. And Beard's essay is really, I need to get that into this paper, but it's fascinating, right? It's a fascinating essay, really worth reading for lots of reasons, including that there is, that his central argument is about sort of the what he thinks are obscure provisions of the Constitution, using obscure in a technical sense to refer to provisions that have no content, right? And then he argues, and therefore, when we're dealing with these provisions, it's up to to other actors, to judges or officials, who's ever doing it, to make up the content. It really, really interesting essay. Can I start with just asking you a quick question, and then I'll follow up. So, do you, I see you as an intellectual historian, but like most intellectual historians, you don't say much about your methodological pre-commitments in your work. So, would you associate yourself with the Cambridge School or some other approach, or you're eclectic, or what's going on here at the level of sort of the theory of intellectual history? As you might guess, I'm really interested in what your theory is.
Okay. I could say a little about that. I'm not very theory-oriented, and I don't really like reading a lot of methodological work in much at all. But yeah, I mean, I have some sympathies for the Cambridge School, so I would say that there's some of that. But you know, I mean, the book that I think that was most influential for me was you know, in graduate school, was Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, which is essentially about the way in which, for those who haven't read it, it's essentially about the way in which certain disputes in English constitutionalism sort of came across, and then American colonists saw what was happening in light of those concepts and worked themselves up into a lather to the point where they had a revolution. So I don't think of Bailyn as a Cambridge School person, but you know, I just think of that as straight up. That's what I would say is the closest. The way that certain concepts that may have existed in some particular place and time get adopted and used in some different disputes, and so I don't know if that's a good answer.
No,
yeah.
that's helpful. So
Yeah.
Here's how my question goes. First part is just,
Oh, but let me just add one thing. I got that. I mean, anybody could read that book. It's a classic book. But I was a student of Isaac Kramnik's at Cornell, and you know, he's written on the American Revolution and Bolingbroke and His Circle and on English constitutionalism, and he's a political theorist, but he's mostly an intellectual historian, and he's my direct
right,
influence.
your direct influence. So,
Yeah.
From my perspective, I have a certain amount of frustration with work in intellectual history for the following reason, right? You know, approaching these same issues in a very analytic and conceptually precise way, it frequently looks like intellectual historians are putting things in the same box that belong in very different boxes because they do not read, this is going to sound awful, but I do think it's true, they do not read their sources very carefully. They read them, they spend a lot of time reading them, but because they do not have an analytic bent, they don't work on sorting out the content, right? And so, of course, the content may be irrelevant from a certain perspective because it doesn't really matter what the fine-grained idea is. It sort of matters more, you know, a la Quentin Skinner, what use was this idea being put to? Right? And I don't want to deny the validity and importance of that enterprise. Important enterprise, you know, valid enterprise, but when it touches on topics that I'm concerned with, I frequently feel frustrated. So let me just say something then, that's the lead up, about the history of originalism. So there's a conventional story about the history of originalism, and it goes something like this. You know, well, there were these originalist ideas all along, right? And you know, you can find lots of passages and cases and talk about the Constitution where people talk about the text. There are early references to the intentions of the framers and original intent and so on, right? And then the idea is that somewhere in the early 1970s, Robert Bork, and then later Raoul Berger, and then William Rehnquist sort of started to develop originalism, and then, then we get Breast, who coins the word, and Mises' speeches, and then, there are various things that happen in the mid-1970s. Richard Kay writes an actual article that takes the Brecht label, embraces it, and starts to develop it theoretically. Scalia gives his famous speech to the Mies Office of Legal Counsel, and that's when the shift, so in about 1985, the shift from original intent, which only actually had one theoretical adherent, I think, which was Richard Kay, begins, and then subsequent development in the 90s. So that's the conventional story. And I told that story, greatly to my regret, right? Sort of going back and looking but going back again and looking at the sources, I would say originalism as a constitutional theory, as a theoretical movement, not as sort of a broad tendency that has some affiliation with text or intent. But as a theory, that's not in Bork's article. Bork's article barely mentions original intent. It has a Thayerian component, but you go back and you're astonished. What it says about the actual First Amendment is, well, this does not provide content, so we have to build a theory of what freedom of speech is, right? That's what he actually says. Doesn't sound very originalist. It's not originalist. He was not an originalist at that stage. He doesn't become an originalist until the 1980s and The Tempting of America, but he didn't write The Tempting of America. The Tempting of America was written from first page to last by Steve Calabrese. So Rehnquist's article, right, which is a criticism of living constitutionalism, does not have anything remotely approaching originalism in it. It also, to the extent it's anything, is sort of more Thayerian, really more of a Jeremiah against living constitutionalism, against the Warren Court making things up. Right now, Warren Burger, in the book, Government by Judiciary, has...
Raoul.
Raoul Burger, not Warren Burger, who wrote he must have written. We don't remember. Raoul Burger,
a
Government by Judiciary, has a chapter called Original Intent, right? And you could say that, is some form of originalism. But if you look at that book as a whole, and you read the chapter on original intent, I think you really have to stretch to say that he has some theory of originalism. He is making conventional legal arguments, and original intent arguments were, those are conventional arguments. Anyone can make them. Lots of people have made them. That was the argument he had. That's the argument he made. There's no theory of originalism there. The theory of originalism doesn't get worked out until the 1990s. That's when originalism as a constitutional theory starts. And this approach that says, well, originalism, it's conservatism, and anyone who mentions the word original is a conservative, right, is somehow part of some long historical trend. I mean, there's nothing wrong with observing these tendencies, right? That's good, but I find it just frustrating. I'll just put it that way. It's frustrating to have this account offered of the history of originalism, which I think is highly misleading if you're interested in originalism as a constitutional theory.
Okay. There's a lot there, obviously.
By the way, so I guess the rule was technically satisfied. I said no hating on philosophers. Hating on historians is cool. I'm fine with that.
Okay. It's interesting the sentence you end on and say, if you're interested in originalism X, you really should take into account the subtleties that you've discussed. And I'll take that point as an excellent point. However, I've always said that I'm not interested in originalism. In fact, the book I'm writing, these things are little pieces. They're not chapters of it. But I deliberately stopped the book in 1980 because I don't want to get into the originalism. No, of course I'm invited to conferences, and that's where people told me I'm doing the history of originalism, but I don't like that label. I'm doing the history of conservative constitutional thought. I'm not doing originalism. Everyone wants to hear about originalism, you know, that's why I'm here. But in what I actually do, I'm agnostic. I mean, I'm not. I have views about it, but I'm not interested in the culminating moment of originalism, other than as the postscript. I'm interested in what how conservatives think about the Constitution, and I don't want to write originalism because actually I do agree that I think there are people who do it better. Also, I remember it, so it's not as interesting to me, you know. So I kind of lived through it, and so I'm kind of a little less interested in that. So I don't want to, I am not interested. I mean, I spoke about it here. But what I would say, to go beyond that, is I'm not sure I agree with everything you say there, but I think the general point that there's more sophisticated dimensions to this, I'll take that point. But of course, part of it is I just didn't want to discuss it because that can go down quite a rabbit hole. Because of course, you know, there's Hugo Black, and then there's what's the guy at University of Chicago, the quirky guy who did the debate about whatever his name is, back in the 40s, Robert Bork's teacher, Krosky. There's all of that, and I did say that a lot of what we think of as originalism is progressive, is majoritarian progressivism. So I think it's interpenetrated with progressive thought, and to actually set that out carefully, which I think is worth doing, I don't want to even start, and to the extent that I did it here of necessity, it's a bit of a quick overview. But I don't want to retreat totally on that. I stick to the basic point that I made. That doesn't lead me to repeal much, or if anything, that's in my paper. I'm going to stick by my paper on that, on the broad outlines, that this is a useful way of thinking about it. Whether something started 5 years before, or whether there's the genesis of Bork's idea. I've already said he's a progressive, you know, and Mises a progressive. So I'm going to stick, you know, for purposes of the paper, I would stick with that. Let me just make another 2 points, I think. One is, I also take your point about intellectual historians and maybe the sloppiness about concepts, particularly in areas of law. However, you know, I don't want to just go over my whole biography, but, you know, I'm not an intellectual historian. I'm a political scientist, and to a certain extent, you know, I'm kind of a mutt. I mean, I've studied American political development. Being at Cornell, I couldn't help but absorb some postmodern ideas, although I did not subscribe to them. But you know, things about ideology and hegemony and stuff like that. But also, you know, I've been to law school. So, and, you know, I had Steve Calabrese as my professor, you know, and it wasn't about, I had it from comparative constitutionalism. And I had a class, at the same time I had Steve Calabrese, I had Michael Perry going over Bork's book, line by line. And, but that's not even that important. And I had jurisprudence classes, but even more important is, you know, I've been to law school generally. So I'm very attuned to doctrinal issues. And I think, you know, it's true. It doesn't appear in this particular piece. But if you go back to my book, Constructing Civil Liberties, one of the virtues I would say for it is that it's very attentive to precise legal arguments. And so even if it's not in here, sometimes, like, the way I see that background is like, I hope I don't make mistakes, I hope I don't say certain things that would contradict a sophisticated understanding of legal doctrine, even if that's not my topic. And final point about Beard. So I saw you cited that. I don't remember if it was for this conference or something else. The interesting thing about Beard, and maybe this, I would say maybe this makes my point, although I don't know enough about the history of Beard's intellectual trajectory, but my crude understanding of it is, this article that I cite called The Living Constitution from the Annals of American Political Journal of whatever, Political and Social Science, I think it's from 1938. And in 1912, Beard was very anti-constitutionalist and very anti-found, and that's what he's most famous for, right? His critique of the founding, his harsh critique of the founding. From 1912 to 1938, he's kind of, it seems to me, just looking at things at those two data points, I don't know what's in between, that he's decided that he doesn't need to make that type of argument. He doesn't need to condemn the founders and the founding as hopeless and useless. He can just say, look, there is this open-ended texture to the Constitution, and as a historian, political parties and interests have been arguing about how to interpret that open end from the founding to the... So he seems to have moved to safer ground, and that's kind of what I'm arguing for, right? That's the sign of Franklin Roosevelt in the White House, you know? Why should he continue denouncing the Constitution? Franklin Roosevelt doesn't denounce the Constitution, you know? He starts taking up aspirational views about for freedom speech. Not all constitutional, but his other speeches about Second Bill of Rights and all, he's very, Roosevelt goes pre-constitution, and Beard is either a part of that or a harbinger of that, and that's a trajectory about making arguments. You might as well, maybe this is, if you're a revolutionary, I've talking to Robin West about this. I mean, that's the moment of great disappointment for the radicals, right? That this was their time to break free from this and this rights discourse or whatever, liberalism, and they did, and it gets folded into it, and maybe this is why, people would be critical of Jim, right? That this is mainstream stuff in a way, that it accepts the basic liberal premise and stuff like that. So the Beard trajectory is a very interesting one to think about in this regard. So I'll stop with that.
Sat? And if you want to line up in the queue, okay. Jim next. About
15 minutes.
anybody else interested in?
Just a quick point, Ken, actually 2 points. Number one, your conflation of a couple of ideas, certainly Jim would not accept, and I think is wrong. And namely, the idea of conflating the idea of the philosophic approach with the living Constitution approach. I think it's important to keep in mind what the so-called philosophic approach is. It most certainly is not turning our affairs over to philosophers. It's most certainly not trying to recruit philosophers to the bench. Judges have a very difficult job. They've got to take a lot of things into consideration. They've got to take history into consideration. They have to take text in consideration. They have to take the expectations of the public into consideration. They have to write an opinion that the public will think reasonable. And they have to give reasons for their opinions, and there are certain fairly clear criteria of what counts as a reason and what doesn't count as a reason. Just to give you one example, one of the things that doesn't count for a reason, and as a matter of fact may be the most powerful reason of all, cosmically speaking, is that, for example, gay sex and gay marriage are contrary to the will of God. That's a reason, and that may be the best damn reason of all. But nevertheless, it's not a reason that counts with us. So they are constrained by the reasons that they give. Now, text doesn't speak for itself. Precedent doesn't speak for itself. History doesn't speak for itself. You're not really sure what you can get away with. You're not really sure whether your reason is a good reason. And throughout all of these steps, you have to make controversial choices. The philosophic approach is simply the approach of a judge or another constitutional interpreter who takes his or her fallibility very seriously and tries to think self-critically for himself or herself and to give a public accounting for the decision at the end of this process.
I'll take that as a good point.
Anybody else?
I don't have an answer.
Okay. I am not an intellectual historian, but I appreciate the disciplinary division of labor between intellectual historians and constitutional theorists, I think more than Larry seems to. And so I don't. So I think it's valuable to have the big. I think it's valuable to have the big picture. I think it's valuable to have the broad brush portrait. I think it helps understand things in context, even if I myself, in talking about particular brushstrokes in the larger canvas, might be a little fussier and exegetical about exactly what people were saying. But I think both are extremely valuable enterprises, and I think they aid understanding in a larger way. So I welcome the intellectual historical perspective that you've offered on the struggle between history and aspirationalism over the course of American political and constitutional development. Now, I have a question for Larry. I don't want to overread or overreact to what you said, but it seemed to me that you were saying that if Ken and I were just to embrace, say, Keith Whittington's account of the old originalism, and if we were to embrace your account of the development of originalism in constitutional originalism and debate, if we were just to quote them verbatim, we would be offering a misleading account of originalism. That seemed to be what you were saying. And I'm just befuddled and stunned by that proposition. I also want to know what it is that Bork was doing, that Raoul Berger was doing, that William Rehnquist was doing. If we're going to have to exclude them from the canon of originalism, because originalism as a theory didn't start until 1990, how are we to conceive of what they were doing? How are we to characterize what their positions are? How are we going to engage with them? I mean, we lived through the development of originalism, right? What were we talking about when we engaged with those people? Were we having false imaginary debates with something that wasn't originalism?
So just the way this happened is, I think it was Whittington's account, but I got the conventional account.
I fully accepted Whittington's account, and I thought you offered a similar
then I
account.
went back and started reading the authors he cited carefully, looking for the exact passages that would have been their originalism. So the Bork article, the Bork First Amendment article, I just don't see how anyone can think that that was originalism. It's a mishmash. It's not really very coherent in a certain sense. But the thing that comes across most strongly in it is, progressivism is a Thayerian theory. And the same thing with Rehnquist. There's just not originalism there. People attribute this. People say these were the originalists, but they're just tiny little fragments of original intent in them. Now, Berger did what he did, right, which is he had a big chapter making original intent arguments against the Supreme Court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment.
Right.
But there's no theory in
Right.
that chapter, and that's what that was.
Right.
So I guess what I would say is that, much to my chagrin, I have decided that my understanding of the emergence of originalism will not bear careful scrutiny of the actual texts
Right.
that are cited as evidence for this is,
Right.
this was originalism, this was the old originalism. There's lots of originalist ideas that are out there, but I think that the founding moment of originalism really is Ed Meese makes those speeches, he puts together the Office of Legal Counsel. They then are charged with developing a constitutional jurisprudence for the Reagan administration. This is Reagan's second term. So
Right.
this enterprise starts in 1985. And right at that same time, Scalia comes and says, junk original intent, right? Scalia was against all consultation of intent, right? And all use of legislative history on the statutory side. I just had a conversation with Scalia about this, and he answered the question as to why it was he gave this speech, right? And he said, I committed myself to these positions. It just seemed to me obvious that we had to move from original intent to original meaning. And then that got uptake from this group, right? And so they then began to work out a theory. Who were those people, right? Those people are the people who wrote in the night, who then moved into academics, right, early in their careers and began writing originalist scholarship. So this is Gary Lawson, Steve Calabrese, Sai Prakash, a whole group of people who had been in the OLC,
Right.
Michael Paulson, who'd been in the OLC and then started to work out the theory. So I'm not making any claims about that there weren't originalist ideas, but I really think that the history is dressed by coining the term, right? And then the second act being Meese giving the speeches, and especially the ABA speeches. That's what really created originalism.
Right.
May I intervene here quickly? Ken would like to respond first, and then Jim, because Ken hasn't had a chance to respond yet. So, yeah.
I definitely want to hear your response
yeah,
to this.
but it is his paper, so I think his response is brief, and then y'all
Okay, go
can
ahead.
kick it some more.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, one question I would ask is, what difference does it make? I mean, one thing. I mean, it might date it slightly differently, and, you know, it happened, I hate to say this about Barry Cushman, who I like, but, you know, I mean, if we shift the date of the change back a few years, or forward a few years in this case, I'm not sure that ultimately it makes that much of a difference. But anyway, I haven't thought about that. So, but Raoul Berger, certainly all of these people were condemning a way of interpreting the Constitution that the Warren Court was engaged in, or in Bork's case, you know, any interpretation of free speech that wasn't about political speech. And there's a default. It was an emphatic rejection of something, and consistently. And what was the default? That's one question I would have for you. Second of all, I read, you know, I've been researching conservative magazines, so I don't remember this, but I mean, I remember enough of it. I remember reading the National Review's review of Raoul Berger's Government by Judiciary, and I would have to go back and reread it. But there was certainly an announcement in National Review that this book changes everything. You know, this is our banner. And I don't know whether they called it originalist. I don't know what they called it. But they viewed it as a sea change for conservatism. And I don't know, if it were just a criticism of the Warren Court, like Brent Bozell criticized the Warren, he had a book-length critique of the Warren Court, that was not originalism. I think it was in 1966. And Brent Bozell's view was in this book-length, there's a book-length thing by Brent Bozell called the Warren Court. And what he says is, you know, we don't have to follow the founders. I mean, they were same thing as Diamondish, right? They're good, they probably were wise, but we're not obligated to follow them. I mean, there was a sense that what Berger did in the National Review was that this is a theory, this is a rallying cry, and that this will set the terms of the debate. I don't remember what the precise language was, but something had changed, and the National Review recognized it at least.
Very quickly, I just want to let people know we have 5 minutes left, and since people have to leave, I'm going to end it on time. Jim first, and then Linda, or how you want to go, Jim? You all want to give?
Well,
If everybody else has a turn, then I'll go.
okay.
Okay, but 5 minutes, that's it.
All right. Well, I'm all for highly sophisticated, or development of highly sophisticated constitutional theories, as Larry well knows. But I think I have a more ecumenical conception of what the canon of constitutional theory is. And so I don't think it has to be highly self-conscious, methodological, sophisticated in order to be something we should reckon with as a theory. And historically, I know that when I was in graduate school from 1977 on, we were reckoning in earnest with something that we thought had something to do with original intent and later original meaning. And so I think it would be unfortunate if we thought about the canon of constitutional theory so narrowly that that didn't even come within it, or if that didn't come within the family of theories that we now call originalism. So,
Forgive me, okay, I don't know whether Larry would like to respond, but Linda is, okay, Linda's next, and then if there's time left, Saad. Huh?
Okay, so
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, then, okay. Well,
I just want to be very, very
3 minutes.
brief here, which is that Jim has written a book, and the fact that Larry Solomon was working on an incredibly sophisticated new vision about what he what he had accepted before it's a little challenging, because Jim has a book that's already going into copy edit, and so the practical question is what way forward. And I think that Larry's going to write his 3 volumes, and you're going to have a conference on that. But right now, the practical thing is, like Ken says, what difference does it make? And it's kind of like people, would say liberalism's a moving target. You think you've got a critique of liberalism down. They say, oh, but you didn't look at this or you didn't look at that. So Jim tried to work with what he understood originalism to be, and that's the book he's writing. He can try to take into account these refinements, but ultimately, if you're focusing on the level of practice and argumentation and rhetoric and politics, and Ken trying to help by supplementing by looking at actually movement politics, I mean, he's got to do what he can do. And I think that, to me, I mean, I thought what was most interesting in Ken's paper was the kind of plea at the end of the, well, not a plea, but the observation at the end of the paper to avoid false binaries, right? And just, we sort of began this thing with taxonomy, and we're kind of ending with taxonomy. But there's a practical problem with having to talk about something. And this isn't really a question, this is just an observation.
Okay, 2 minutes left.
Yeah, it's your own panel. Yeah. Donate your time.
Microphone.
Well, I had a small comment on, and I enjoyed the way you put it. Like I think it was refreshing and it was a very different angle on how to see things on this discussion. So I'm somehow think that the discussion itself shows that it brings something to the table that we were not seeing. So I like that very much, and especially I was interested in highlighting that even though you say that you were more like in a descriptive way, you agree that there's a lot of art in that is. So that was just great. Like, don't missing that part of, because at some point it becomes very, very, very narrow just to say, well, that's the is and they are not making it. No, that's the is. They did make these decisions. They did. So I was like, I like that part of like the way you put it, the methodology. So I think that's nice. And I completely see Larry's interest in getting the originalism and conservative and the ideology, but that's you who you are usually like making that point. But I think some other of the people associated with originalism are really like very into the Republican Party and to that politics and ideology. So I think it works for you, but I'm not sure that it will work for other people to make these kind of moves.
We're actually at, Ken, do you want to respond very quickly? No. Okay, thank you for a provocative, wonderful paper.